In the middle of the 1800s, mining companies came to the shores of Lake Superior believing they had reached untouched ground. The copper country of the Keweenaw Peninsula in northern Michigan was supposed to be a frontier, raw and unworked. Instead, when the crews began to dig, they kept breaking into holes that were already there. Shallow pits, filled with rubble and centuries of leaf litter, ran in lines across the ridges. Inside them lay stone hammers by the thousand, worn and broken. And in one working, miners found a great mass of native copper that someone had already pried loose from the bedrock, lifted onto a cradle of timber, and then, for reasons no one could explain, left behind. The wood beneath it had rotted almost to nothing. In 1863, the Smithsonian published a survey of these ancient diggings by a geologist named Charles Whittlesey. The Ojibwe of the region had long spoken of this copper as something old and charged with meaning. So the copper country holds two records at once: a landscape mined thousands of years ago by people who then stopped, and a living tradition tied to the same ground. Who were the first miners of Lake Superior, and why did they walk away from a job half finished? To take that seriously, we should begin with the physical evidence, because before any legend is added, the mines themselves are astonishing. The copper country runs along the southern shore of Lake Superior and out into the lake itself. The Keweenaw Peninsula juts north into the water in northern Michigan, and about 50 miles offshore lies Isle Royale, a long wooded island now protected as a national park. Both are made, in part, of rock streaked with native copper, which is copper in its pure metallic form, not locked in ore, but sitting in the bedrock as veins, sheets, and solid masses. And across both, wherever that copper reaches the surface, the ground is pocked with ancient pits. There are thousands of them. On Isle Royale, the concentration of old mining pits at a place called the Minong Workings is among the largest ever recorded anywhere. Isle Royale is worth pausing on because it is such an unlikely place to find heavy industry. It is a remote island in the coldest, deepest part of Lake Superior, hard to reach even now, with no permanent population and thick boreal forest running down to the water. And yet its ridges are lined with ancient copper workings, which means people crossed miles of open, frigid lake in small craft, again and again across the centuries, to mine an island. The copper they came for often lay in the rock as pure masses, some small enough to pry out by hand, some enormous, sheets and lumps of solid metal that the miners had to work around and cut down over long stretches of labor. These are not natural features. Each pit was dug by hand, following a vein of copper down into the rock, and the tools that dug them are still scattered through the debris. The most common are hammerstones, rounded cobbles carried up from the lake beaches, many of them grooved so a handle could be lashed on, almost all of them battered and cracked from use. Early miners and later archaeologists found them in staggering numbers, the discarded hand tools of a workforce that labored here across an immense span of time. The scale of the tool marks is hard to overstate. On the beaches below the workings, the ancient miners gathered smooth, hard cobbles by the countless thousand, and the discarded, shattered remains of those hammerstones still litter the ground around the pits and pour out of the spoil heaps. Each one represents a day of pounding by a pair of hands, and there are enough of them to describe not a handful of prospectors, but a sustained, organized effort carried on across generations. Alongside the hammers, the miners left the copper they were after in every stage of working, from raw masses still half in the rock to sheets and nuggets hammered partway into shape. The method those tools reveal is careful and clever. To break copper free from hard rock without metal tools of their own, the ancient miners used fire. They built fires against the rock face to heat it, then threw water on the hot stone so it cracked and flaked, and then went to work in the fractured seam with their hammerstones, pounding the surrounding rock away to expose the copper and beat it loose. It is slow, patient, effective mining, and the scorched and shattered rock inside the old workings still shows how it was done. Then there's the age, which is the detail that resets everything. Careful dating places the start of this mining astonishingly far back. People were digging copper on the Keweenaw as early as 8,000 years ago, and on Isle Royale around 6,500 years ago. That makes these some of the oldest metal mines anywhere on Earth. This work was already ancient when the pyramids of Egypt were built. It began before Stonehenge stood on its plain. The first miners of Lake Superior were at work in a world almost unimaginably distant from the men who rediscovered their pits. If you enjoy slow documentaries that trace forgotten history through original records and archaeology, take a moment to subscribe, because it genuinely helps these longer videos reach the people who like them. Because the scale of what these miners left behind was large enough that when the first surveyor tried to describe it, his report became one of the founding documents of American archaeology. That surveyor was Charles Whittlesey, a geologist and Army veteran who had spent years working across the frontier and who studied the ancient diggings in detail. He came to the copper country as the modern mining boom was tearing into the same hills the ancient miners had worked, which meant the old pits were being exposed and destroyed at the very moment he was trying to record them. In 1863, he published his findings through the Smithsonian Institution under the title Ancient Mining on the Shores of Lake Superior. It was one of the early volumes in the Smithsonian's Contributions to Knowledge series, and it did something important. It treated the pits not as a curiosity, but as evidence, mapping the workings and documenting the tools and arguing plainly that this was the work of an ancient people who had mined here long before living memory. What staggered Whittlesey, and everyone who came after him, was the sheer amount of labor the landscape represented. Thousands of pits, countless broken hammers, veins followed deep into the rock, all of it done by hand. In the excitement that followed, some 19th century writers tried to put a number on how much copper had been removed across the millennia, and the estimates climbed into the hundreds of millions of pounds, and in the boldest versions, into the billions. Modern archaeologists regard the wildest of those figures as far too high, the product of enthusiasm rather than measurement, but even conservative estimates describe an enormous quantity of metal moved out of these hills by people using stone and fire. The most haunting thing the ancient miners left, though, was not a pit or a tool, but an interruption. In more than one old working, the people who came after found a large mass of native copper that had already been cut and hammered loose from the surrounding rock, prized up, and set on a framework of logs, ready to be moved, and then simply left there. The timber cradle had rotted away beneath it over the centuries, but the arrangement was unmistakable. Someone had done the hardest part of the work, freeing a heavy mass of metal from solid stone, and then stopped, one step short of carrying it home. Whether that particular job was abandoned in a single afternoon or over a season, no one can say. But the image of it, a prize freed and then left behind, sits at the center of this whole mystery, and that copper went somewhere. This is one of the most solid and remarkable facts in the whole story. Native copper from the Lake Superior deposits was worked into tools and ornaments and traded across a vast stretch of the continent. Copper that started in the Keweenaw and Isle Royale has been found in ancient burial mounds far to the south and east, in the earthworks of the Hopewell peoples and beyond, hundreds and even thousands of miles from the lake. A single object survives from this trade in a way that anyone can still go and see. The Ontonagon Boulder, a mass of native copper weighing thousands of pounds, sacred to the Ojibwe and long known to them on the Ontonagon River, was removed in the 1800s and eventually placed in the Smithsonian's collection, where it remains. So the physical case is overwhelming. Ancient, vast, skilled, and connected to half a continent. And this is exactly the moment where an honest documentary has to slow down, because a story this striking attracts explanations it does not need. Because for more than a century, some writers could not accept that Native Americans had done this. This was the same era that produced the so-called mound builder myth, the false and popular idea that the great earthen mounds of the eastern woodlands had been raised by some vanished superior race rather than by the ancestors of living native nations. The ancient copper mines were pulled into that same fantasy. Writers invented lost races to take the credit, vanished white civilizations, wandering old world miners, refugees from Atlantis, anyone but the ancestors of the people who were actually living beside these mines. That entire tradition of theory is worth naming once and then setting down, because it is not supported by any evidence, and it grew out of a refusal to believe what the ground plainly shows. The archaeology is clear. The earliest miners of Lake Superior were the ancestors of today's American Indian nations. There is no lost race here to find. The inflated numbers deserve the same honest treatment. When you strip away the billion-pound estimates and the breathless 19th century arithmetic, you are still left with something genuinely large. But you are left with a human quantity, mined over thousands of years by many generations, not a single impossible feat. And the deepest question, why the intensive mining eventually wound down, has answers that are ordinary rather than eerie. Ways of life change over thousands of years. Climates shift, populations move, trade networks rise and fall, and the reasons that people stop doing something on the old scale are usually many small reasons rather than one dramatic event. The half-finished look of an abandoned working is haunting, but it does not require a catastrophe. Archaeologists have their own quieter candidates for why the great age of copper mining faded. Over thousands of years, the people of the region developed new materials and new ways of living, including pottery and, much later, different trade goods, and the intense focus on native copper may simply have given way to other priorities. The best sources near the surface may have been worked out, making the remaining copper harder to reach for less reward. Trade networks that once carried Lake Superior copper across the continent shifted and reformed many times. Any or all of these could dial down a mining tradition without a single dramatic ending. Most likely the work faded rather than fell, slowly, unevenly, for reasons that made sense at the time and left no note behind. That leaves us suspended where this format likes to sit, with the mundane explanations doing real work and a genuine mystery still standing behind them. because the people who lived beside these mines are not gone, and they remember. The Ojibwe, or Anishinaabe, of the Lake Superior country have long held the copper of this land as something significant, old, and charged with power, tied into their traditions and their sense of the place. In some accounts, the copper is guarded, dangerous to take carelessly, watched over by beings of the deep water, a memory that folds the danger of the lake and the value of the metal into one idea. Those traditions are history and identity, not entertainment, and they belong to a people still living in the same country. It is worth remembering that the copper of this region was not just raw material to the peoples who worked it. In the ancient world of the Great Lakes, copper was among the most valued substances there was, hammered into knives, spear points, awls, beads, and ornaments, carried in trade across enormous distances, and placed with the dead in the mounds of the south. A metal that could be found in pure, workable masses, that could be beaten and polished to a warm shine, was rare and remarkable, and the people who controlled its source held something the whole continent wanted. The reverence in the Ojibwe traditions is not decoration laid over an industrial site. It fits a metal that mattered enormously to everyone who ever handled it. And here the tradition and the archaeology quietly line up. The National Park Service, describing the ancient mines, notes plainly that oral tradition and the historical sources are consistent with the archaeological data. The Ojibwe accounts of an old and significant relationship to this copper sit beside physical proof of an old and significant working of it. Where traditions describe fire and labor against the rock of the copper country, archaeologists have documented exactly that, the fire setting and the hammerstones inside the pits. The obvious objection is worth answering directly. How could any memory reach back across so many thousands of years? And the honest answer is that we do not claim it reaches unbroken to the very first miners. We only observe that the people who have lived longest beside these mines carry a tradition that matches, in its shape and its respect, what the excavations reveal. There is also the simple fact of continuity to weigh. The Anishinaabe have lived in the Lake Superior country for a very long time, and their own histories describe a long migration that brought them to these shores, to the place where, as their tradition puts it, the food grows on the water, the wild rice country of the upper Great Lakes. A people who have lived beside a landscape of ancient pits for many generations, who prize the metal those pits produced, and whose accounts of that metal match the physical evidence in shape and in spirit, are not making an idle claim on it. Their relationship to the copper country is deep, documented, and ongoing. That alignment does not prove a continuous memory reaching to the very first miners. It is simply harder to dismiss than coincidence. None of this closes the case. It is entirely possible that the earliest miners of 8,000 years ago in the historic Ojibwe are separated by more change than any tradition could bridge, and that the alignment is partial rather than exact. That is the honest limit. The convergence here is a question, not a verdict. Here is what nobody seriously disputes. The pits are real, and there are thousands of them across the Keweenaw and Isle Royale. The mining began thousands of years ago, and is among the oldest anywhere. The tools, the fire setting, and the abandoned copper masses are physical fact. Whittlesey documented it for the Smithsonian in 1863. Lake Superior copper traveled across the continent. And the Ojibwe hold a living tradition tied to this same ground. Those are the solid stones. Here is where the questions begin. We do not know the true total of copper the ancient miners removed, only that it was large and that the biggest old estimates are unreliable. We do not know the full identity of the very earliest miners of 8,000 years ago, or every step of the long chain of peoples who worked here after them. And we do not know exactly why the mining wound down, or why, in that one working, a mass of copper was raised onto timber and then left where it sat. Walk the Keweenaw Peninsula today, and you can still find the depressions in the ground where ancient people opened the earth, softened now under moss and forest. On Isle Royale, the old pits of the Minong workings still dimple the ridges above Lake Superior. The battered hammerstones sit in museum cases and park collections, and the copper itself is still in the rock, the same pure metal that drew people to these shores 8,000 years ago, and has never entirely let them go. History is rarely settled by a single mine or a single report. It is assembled slowly, one survey, one excavation, one carefully kept tradition at a time, and some of it stays out of reach. The first miners of Lake Superior sit in that unreachable zone, proven by the pits, remembered along the shore and never fully named. Thank you for walking the copper country with me. If you want more of these, the kind that follow one thread of North American history until it disappears into the ground, consider subscribing, because that is exactly what the next one does. Until then, a question worth sitting with. When the ground itself proves that people mined here for thousands of years and then walked away, and when the Ojibwe still hold this copper as something old and full of power, who were the first to strike fire against this rock, and what finally made them stop?